Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio, a product of the Center for Stateless Society. I'm your host. My name's Corey Massimino. I'm here with Tux Pacific. Tux is a cryptographer, anarchist, and the founder of Entropy, a decentralized custodian for crypto. Tux's crypto-inclusive perspective has been shaped by their non-traditional background as a trans person and a market post-left-ish anarchist. You can reach Tux on Twitter at __Tux, T-U-X, or through email, tux@entropy.xyz. So, Tux, thanks for joining the podcast.
Yeah, of course. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you on. So obviously you are big into the crypto area. And so I thought it'd be really neat to have you on and kind of pick your brain about that stuff. I'm not super well versed in it, a little bit, like a lot of people in our circles are, certainly, because we kind of talk about it and see a lot of potential in it. But I'm not actually active in that, in a practical way. So I'm very curious to kind of hear about your perspective on this stuff. And I think maybe a lot of our audience is probably more of novices as well, but I'm sure there's some experts there too. Maybe you could just tell us in your own words what cryptocurrency is, but what are the biggest misconceptions you think a lot of people come to the topic with?
Sure. So cryptocurrency is, it's like sort of like digital money. I don't like to use the term digital money for it often because it's only like one facet for it. To me, cryptocurrency is sort of like this new, exciting way to access decentralized markets, and really of just like making it exceptionally clear and present that what you're accessing is a market. In some ways, those markets are free markets, and in some ways, those markets are less so free markets. But to me, it's just kind of like a means and infrastructure to sort of engage in, wide-scale financial economic technology that has no one owner of the entire thing.
Okay. So what do you think are some of the misunderstandings that people maybe tend to run into? I guess one would be it's not really a digital money for you. It's a bit of a broader technology. Are there others?
Yeah. So I think some of the misconceptions people have with it is that we're just trying to replace the existing monetary system, which, I'm not going to knock. There are people who are attempting to do that, and I think that's an interesting attempt to do something. But it's not exactly like I think for me, the biggest reason why I'm in it. Another misconception I think people have of it is just like the different kind of infrastructure that's really in place. Like, I think people are mostly familiar with, say, like decentralized exchanges where you can trade crypto for crypto in sort of ways that are not necessarily controlled. But to me, there's also a number of different things that, you can do with it. For example, like I'm anti-copyright and don't really believe in intellectual property to that degree that a lot of people might. But it's kind of like an interesting method of putting those rights more specifically on something and allowing people to engage in it and making it a little bit more flexible. It allows us to do things like utility rights. Like if you're actually using something, you can actually demonstrably see that and prove it in some ways. And, you can like kind of build structure and economic conditions for how those rights and things should be shaped. I think those are probably the two biggest misconceptions, I think, with it.
Interesting.
I'm trying to think. Yeah, one of the other misconceptions, I think, is mostly just around like how markets work in that space, where it's like, in many ways, people think, oh, these markets are predominantly owned by wealthy people who have control. And, that is true for some things. But in many ways, I also think it's much more fair than, say, the existing systems, because while there are wealthy people in crypto and, as they're called whales, who have access to, more resources than, say, the average person does, to me, it's also this kind of unique method of like accessing markets and exchange and doing mutual exchange, really, that isn't regulated by any particular entity in many ways. So, instead of having to ask permission to trade something, you're able to engage in it directly. And while there are rich people on the other end of that, I think it is a little bit more fair because it's easier to gain access to some of those things.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, maybe to hear more about your background. What drew you to crypto in the first place? How did you end up getting involved in that space?
Yeah, so I've been in crypto for quite some time. I was like an early Bitcoin user back in like 2010, I think 2000, 2010, 2009, I think 2000, somewhere around there. And I mostly heard about it mostly through IRC. And it was just in like, just hacker channels of people just trading things on with using Bitcoin and stuff. And that was my first foray into it. I was like, that's kind of interesting. It's like, because I remember somebody's like, oh, don't pay me on PayPal. I'd rather have Bitcoin. And then they pointed me to like a local Bitcoin ATM where somebody was able to, trade something on that. And, or it was like, whatever the exchange was back in the day. I remember being on Mt. Gox way back when. And then there's, that's kind of like how my first foray into it. And at the time I would have described myself more as like an anarcho-communist, and didn't necessarily like money. Or, even the concept of just exchange in general. I was very against markets at the time. And so engaging with crypto was kind of this interesting thing, like, oh, that's cool, but I hate it. And I didn't really like what it was trying to do. And I was like a freshman in high school. So it was like kind of an interesting thing. I remember like one of my high school drug dealers started taking Bitcoin, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And I was like, that's kind of cool. I never knew anybody would do that. And this is like my junior or senior year. So around like 2013, 2014, that was really happening. And then I went, moved away from home, got a job as just a software engineer. And then I kept hearing about crypto, and I was like, oh, well, this is kind of like something kind of stupid or whatever. And eventually, like, I got really, really into cryptography. And then it became obvious to me, especially when you start, doing more, practical research in cryptography, you start finding that, oh, a lot of these applications are actually in cryptocurrency and, peer-to-peer technology, distributed networking, distributed computation. And that was really like my first engagement with it. And then eventually I got a job at a cryptocurrency company that only lasted for a month because I didn't really like them that much. And after that, I started working at a company called NewCipher to build like a distributed or a decentralized proxy re-encryption network. And I did a lot of the cryptography stuff there. And then that did a whole thing. And now I started Entropy. So mostly through cryptography was my first foray into it. And that's kind of where the politics for me came from. It was just math. Math and engineering and research there. And the more you really dig into it, the more you realize you're like, okay, this is the technology that heavily uses all this kind of cool new research, and it's able to like have like a really gripping way to start getting interested in it.
Well, I think it's really interesting you mentioned your politics at the time of getting into crypto. So maybe this is a good time to bring up talking about the relationship between the technology and your practical work with it and your political views. I'm very interested in that, and I didn't know that your political views have apparently kind of evolved over time. Whose hasn't? But maybe tell us a little bit about that. It's kind of interesting getting into crypto as an anarcho-communist. But
Sure. It was one of those funny. Like I remember very early on, like in middle school, reading like Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, and just being drawn towards communism. And I remember identifying as a communist in middle school, and then eventually, and I feel like there's like kind of a pathway for a lot of communists who have a penchant for just anti-authoritarianism, because the predominant wing of communists, I would say, is authoritarianism and like Marxist-Leninism, social democracy, that kind of thing. And I really did not identify at all with anything remotely authoritarian. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to start investigating anarchism, and really drawn to like Bakunin, Proudhon, some early stuff. And of course, you make the early mistakes that a lot of anarchists do. Like, oh, Chomsky seems kind of cool. And like a few folks like that. And eventually I kind of found my way to Crime Think. And a lot of the Crime Think reading or writing really resonated with me. And especially like some of the early stuff. And I then started getting more into, at the time, I was just talking to someone about this. I was at like an anarchist collective in Salt Lake City, and somebody had given me a Renzo Novatore text, and I was like, this is really beautiful and elegant, and I just like the poetry of it all, and it kind of entranced me a little bit more towards like investigating, like, oh, okay, what does this guy Stirner have to say? What does this guy, eventually from there, like I started reading C4SS stuff, and I was like, okay, what does Tucker have to say? What does Kevin Carson have to say? Like all these interesting people who I started noticing who were on like the kind of edge of like technology, futurism, transhumanism, we're getting really into this market side of stuff. And I really had like a 180 flip on that when I realized I'm like, there's actually a lot of really cool practical things. And like from like a post-left perspective, where I was more kind of identified with then, after I switched from like anarcho-communism, I started finding like getting more, I would say, disenchanted with the left as a whole, and kind of just being like, this feels very anachronistic because, you go to a protest and of course there's always the Marxist-Leninist person trying to get you in a kettle, and then there's a guy like talking about, Lenin said this and Stalin said that, and all these other things, and I'm like, okay, this just doesn't feel like it's getting anything done for me. And eventually I kind of found ways of like markets of seeing like, hey, there's a lot of really cool stuff happening with markets. Bitcoin, what I was already familiar with, was happening, and seeing the pure kind of like technological activism that was happening as a result of this decentralized form of transactions that were occurring. And I kind of like started just seeing some clarity in my own ideology of like, where is this going to develop? How can I take action? What can I do? As like a technologist, as a person who is really trying to like bring about some sort of tangible, real world good with my, skills and everything beyond just cryptography and privacy. I started seeing markets as a way of just doing activism and like actually witnessing kind of like the birth of this whole technology, where people were able to freely exchange and freely collaborate and, get incentivized for doing something, get rewarded, get paid for it. And they were soon able to like, I know several people who are, entirely off the grid, who get paid in cryptocurrency, and they transact only in cash when they need to. And they change out of cryptocurrency to cash, living back and forth, doing these like interesting things. And it occurred to me, I'm like, this is really a way that we're not trying to violently revolt against the government per se, or from these economies. We're just trying to build what is really just like an affinity of folks who want to transact and communicate and participate in an economic system that they feel is more fair, that they can actually do stuff in and feel like they actually have like a chance of, getting by with it. And that really enchanted me, I think. And I didn't really start understanding what a blockchain and what cryptocurrency was really capable of doing until I started understanding a bit more of like what the market was trying to do and what equilibrium actually means, and like actually trying to like bring about some really unique kind of dynamics in game theory that can change society for the better, and that can build products that are not exploitative or rent seeking, that can actually like, reward everyone in the system and create positive feedback loops that make things more fair. So that's kind of like where it suddenly occurred to me. I'm like, that's really neat, and I want to be more involved in that. And that's where I started, I think, identifying more with like market and post-leftism at that time, where I was like, okay, I'm going to leave behind sort of this, what I always considered like utopian, grandiose social engineering kind of thing, where it's like, oh, we have to build like this new thing to do a thing. And I was just kind of like, you know what? I kind of want to just like do a thing that's voluntary, that people can come into, that eventually I feel like ideally people are going to be like, oh, we have to consider this a completely separate entity. It can't be taken down on its own. And, there's a group of people who are now trying to refuse to participate in that system. And that's what kind of got me into it.
It's quite the interesting journey. Crypto kind of bringing you around to seeing a use in markets. Oh, but at the same time, it feels like, and C4SS is an interesting position here because we're kind of at the intersection between anarcho-communism, market anarchism, these different flavors and varieties of ideologies. And so I think crypto is like one of those things that has some kind of like, it's pretty highly contested, I would say, in these circles. Why do you think that for you, crypto made the light bulb go off and like seeing these other arguments for markets? Why do you think that so many anarcho-communists like have not had that reaction, like kind of still see crypto as just another variety of, I guess, market oppression?
I've thought about this, and really what I think is that there's this kind of degree that folks don't understand exactly the kind of game they're playing when they participate in a market, willingly or unwillingly. And I think that's a big part of it. I think there's a huge problem if anyone feels that they have to be forced into participate in a market. obviously no one here is arguing. I don't think there's any market anarchists, or even, I would probably even, anarcho-capitalists or whatever those other folks who want to identify themselves as, that would agree that somebody should be forced to participate in a market. And I don't really think that a lot of anarcho-communists and similar anti-market anarchists understand the game theory at play and the kind of behavioral things that occur in markets. I think that there's my most frequent argument against markets that I will hear is, well, there must be an authoritarian society to do mutual exchange. And that's pretty much what everyone, I think, says, that mutual exchange requires a state. And obviously we don't agree with that perspective. Like, mutual exchange can be is an exchange of anything, a good, an item, a service, product, whatever. And I really wish anarcho-communists would see, to the degree that they do participate in market systems that aren't propagated by the state or upheld by the state. And I think crypto made that so glaringly obvious for me, is when you start participating in things that kind of force your way of rethinking what game theory is at play, like what incentives are there, what feedback loops are you actually participating in, and then realizing like this can all be changed for the better. If we just change the incentives around, if we remove rent seekers, if we remove monopolists, if we remove the state from some of these things, we start seeing markets as a means of reaching information equilibrium, which is really what at heart is what a market really is to me. It's just this idea of saying like, A and B are participating in a market. When A does thing and B does thing, it causes the market to do certain things. And it's kind of this really interesting and unique way of propagating that information into like just what is just numbers, and just kind of like a means of like kind of communicating what is going on, and like supply chains and things, and all these different things that are like components and inputs to this big equation. Suddenly you start seeing these things, you're like, okay, well, how would I, as like a co-op or something, want to do, build a service, or, start distributing food or something? And really they're participating in economic equations that they don't realize that they're doing. It's not just, even if your co-op is just growing food, seeds are a necessary thing to produce any produce, fruit, whatever. And observing seeds as, say, like a commodity in this system, you realize that it's like, this is not something that can just be easily destroyed. Like, there's a thing that's going to produce this thing. And as a producer of, some commodity like seeds, you start realizing like, okay, well, I am participating in something, even if I want to give it out for free, even if I just want to give it out for free, it is still an exchange, even if the state doesn't exist. And there's this degree of like understanding how your actions, giving out something for free, might affect the global whole, like the global economy of whatever you're trying to do. And that to me is like this kind of this gatekeep, this barrier to understanding for a lot of folks. And also, obviously, it kind of has this component of, I think markets do broadly, because they're complex. The science and not science, but the mathematics and of economics and how markets work is certainly complicated. I would not agree that I have a good, solid understanding of, market-based economics. I think you are probably much better than I am at talking about that in depth. And so is Kevin Carson. But, there's interesting things to be said for somebody making a market action and not realizing that they are. And I think when you realize what kind of market actions you are taking, I think your perspective starts to actually change.
I think that's kind of fascinating, because we've converged on similar ideas, but I definitely came from the more right libertarian perspective. So I really enjoy hearing about this from your perspective. I'm kind of curious about how the post-left stuff fits into everything here, and I especially because in your bio you said you were post-left-ish, so I'm kind of curious about the ish too. Could you maybe expand on that?
The post-left-ish thing is mostly because I'm I would say I'm hesitantly allied with the post-left ideal. There's things that I agree with that I'm like, yeah, I don't really like participating in the broader. I love the anti-organization parts of it. I love the There's like some degrees of like anti-industrialization stuff that I'm very interested in, but very hesitant to kind of, align with, because I think there is a lot of harm being done by industrialization, whether that be industrialization itself or if that's the components of the industrialization. I think that's another thing. But there's just a lot of meaning behind saying I'm a post-left anarchist, and I don't really like to just be like, oh, that's me altogether. I will say the label is so people know where I stand on something. But to me, it's just kind of like, it's just very loaded at this point in time. Like some people will say, we actually had a very interesting Twitter interaction where you and William Gillis changed my mind on a lot of this stuff, because I would always have identified as nihilist. And this is something that I think really like actually like, really influenced me. But I actually I don't think I'm a nihilist anymore. That was the thing that I kind of had a misunderstanding of. And I was very, corrected by that. And I was like, okay, that's actually really interesting. I think William Gillis will point out that the early 2000s post-left, 90s post-left people were very different than the ones that were today, who understood nihilism was more of like a tool of fascism than it was, a tool of liberty and libertarianism as a whole. So that's kind of where post-leftism fits for me. I mean, if we want to keep going into it, like things like affinity organizing have always been more of interest to me than, union-based organizing or other elements of left organizing, because I just think that there's this degree of like bureaucracy that ends up upholding itself. The organizations, as many insurrectionists and post-leftists will point out, that soon the organization will serve to build itself as like power and will incentivize itself to stay in power. And then I think it's also very important. I think that some organization, some things will always be organized, and some people always have bureaucracy, because like a market, I feel like bureaucracy is not something that can be easily destroyed either. And I really think that like, affinity organizing and small groups of people doing direct action and participating in like very revolutionary ways is the best way forward. And that's kind of like how it's always been for me.
Okay. Interesting. This kind of ties back into one of my questions about the potential of cryptocurrency, especially looking at crypto from this post-left angle. And I think a lot of people's question to certain post-left ideas regarding organization and coordination, and then also with it in the practical instantiation of crypto, for instance, how does this stuff scale? Is it possible for crypto to scale in a feasible way to become anything more than like a marginal or fringe thing? Earlier, you said you don't necessarily agree with this goal of replacing government currencies. So that's very interesting to me. How does that? Do you see crypto as being more than kind of a marginal tool like it is now for some people?
So, like, the biggest component of crypto that I will always talk about is the ability to opt out. I think this is the biggest thing that this is why, to me, it's the most important thing. And for me, building, like I said, I don't like mass social engineering. I'm not trying to replace, the economy of Canada with the crypto. Like, that's like, whereas like some Bitcoin people will be like, we have to replace all like nation state economies with cryptocurrency. I don't think I want to do that. I think that if you examine state actors as a market force, certainly a very, very strong market force, I think that there is now a more efficient market that can be used as an alternative than the state markets. And I think a slow period of time where we're participating in this, while there's this other market that's growing, whether it be fringe or not, will be more efficient than other things. We're able to observe more market movement in crypto than we are in, say, like the traditional global markets. Like there's actors who are blind, who are, dark forces in this entire thing. And they're also like that in crypto as well. But like, there's things where you can just observe more with crypto. And I think that over time, you'll see a more efficient market form and certain transactions. And I mean, it would be a bit too technical to dive into them now, but there are certainly more things that are more efficient in crypto than they are, in real world assets, certainly with like tokens and things like this that are very, very interesting to participate in. You can just say, hey, this is the measure of skin in the game or interest that I have, and I'm doing an action because of this, and somebody else can take market actions on that side. And it's just really efficient. So I'm not interested in trying to co-opt or reduce, the market force of something else. What I simply really want to do is build an alternative that people can willingly decide or voluntarily decide, I want to participate in this, I don't want to participate in that, and I think I can do this and this and this better there. And I think we'll start to see that grow to be not, if not fringe, at least competitive. That's at least my assumption. I think that within my lifetime, certainly, I think we'll see a very competitive alternative to state-based economies. And people will have to choose, do I want to participate in this or do I want to participate in that? And there are probably some things that we're going to have to willingly choose to participate in state-based economies for. But if you're asking me about like the post-left perspective of this, that's the whole point of the post-left one is I'm not trying to build a gigantic unified left movement against the state. I think that's great. And I think we should support those movements, absolutely. But I think it's very important that people have the opportunity to remove themselves from that equation and say, hey, I'm going to participate in this other thing entirely. I don't need to participate in, that state economy for this thing. I want to be able to do this other thing. And that to me is the core component of post-leftism, which is this ability to say, like, we're different from this movement itself. We don't want to emphasize wide, large scale, social engineering. We want to emphasize what you can do as a person, working together with your friends, mutual exchange, building support systems and solidarity for people like you. We want you to be able to find safe ways of communicating, collaborating, doing whatever, and exchanging things. And I think some of the more interesting things that I want to see pop up are things like decentralized supply chains that might come through entirely of this fringe, quote unquote, fringe economy that's popping up, where we can start seeing, entire supply chains for movements being supplied entirely through this dark economy, really. And to me, that's where the post-left element comes in. It's just that ability to be like, I'm going to opt out of this other wide thing, waiting for this revolution to happen. I'm just going to start doing the thing that I want to do.
Right. Well, I guess I'd be curious to get more into the specifics then of what you mentioned here and there of what you think crypto is good for, of what are the pros, the specific potential involved in that technology that could make it competitive, really, with maybe it can replace or anything but competitive with existing currencies.
So there's a few things there. If you were to ask me where are we in that roadmap of this new economy, I would say we're really early. And I think most crypto people probably would agree with that. This is a technology that's going to take time to develop, but ultimately you can't ignore it. It's not going to be able to just be destroyed entirely. It's going to develop. People are going to participate in it, whether they're state regulated or not. With that said, there's things I am really excited to see happen. And we're slowly but surely getting to the place where these things can happen with efficiency and like actual, practicality. One of those things, like I alluded to, is decentralized supply chains. Supply chains, operated entirely transparently through, crypto itself. That's one of those things. There's a huge supply chain for, say, like things like estrogen. As a trans person, I will say as a trans person, one of the bigger things that I've noticed is, the difficulty of the medical system to get the drugs I need is absurd. And it was actually easier for me, which is funny, as the CEO of a company, which is one of those things that you don't understand, that a lot of people don't understand, is like, it was easier for me to not go to a doctor, but to go to a friend who had black market estrogen that was produced by an anarchist collective, to get that estrogen so I can inject that. And that's literally what I do right now, which is insane. It's cool. And so there's a whole supply chain of ingredients that go into producing that good. And I think someday we're going to see these things move on to maybe this alternative economy that's being, collaborated there. They're precursors to those chemicals, for example. And just being able to say, like, hey, we have a supply chain of things and even final products that we want to be able to distribute widely. We want to be able to distribute estrogen for everyone, but there's a supply chain problem. How do we distribute those? how do we get those across to different places and different populations? And how do we effectively distribute it to those people? And, I think that's a solution for what crypto does really well is market efficiency. It's really good at it. So being able to understand when those exact problems in the supply chain pop up, being able to say like, oh, my producer is down, but there's this other producer that's maybe several nodes away that can produce this good for me instead and might cost a little bit more. How's that going to affect the end cost of this product? Well, now suddenly the entire system can transparently see it, which might interest another manufacturer to go, hey, there's an opportunity for me to produce estrogen here or produce a precursor or something here. And if I do that, then I can arbitrage this and make this much money and do this thing where now suddenly it's like you're influencing certain things to produce things and you're doing things really efficiently. That's something that I am absolutely obsessed with happening. There were attempts at doing this early on in 2017, 2016, 2018. They didn't work because they didn't know what to do. And I don't think that they are going to work because ultimately they were like, oh, let's participate with the state. Let's build the state-regulated version of this. And it just doesn't work because it's hard to beat the efficiency of the state-regulated market on a decentralized network. Like, that's really difficult to do and when you're trying to, essentially tie your operations to state regulation as well. Like, that's the whole point is you don't have this thing, so you can do this other thing. And so decentralized supply chains are one. For a really good example, I think, is also splitting interest between speculators and consumers, which is something that, we have for stocks and also somewhat for commodities as well, only to some degree. But, for example, we could say speculation isn't necessarily held by the stock itself. There's some degree of it, but there's also options and derivatives that allow us to really target the volatility of that speculation in one spot. And I've always talked about this with friends, trying to get them to understand what my perspective is. So I'll try this idea. Everyone knows about if you play the PS5, there's a PS5. There was this PS5 supply shortage essentially, and everyone was trying to get a PS5. And speculation was causing it to just skyrocket in price. So people were paying twice or three times the cost of a PS5 to just get in there early, which means why would I as a consumer purchase that product when I could just sell it for three times the price if I managed to get it on eBay or something, right? Which hurt consumers because consumers were trying to get the PS5 to play. Yeah. They didn't care, And I think there's this degree of where crypto can really shine for this is split the abstract commodification of any item, of any good, really, and put that speculation on somewhere else. So, for example, you can have a token that represents a PS5. So in this case, it would probably be an NFT, which is kind of, cool little buzzword to throw into this conversation. But you have an NFT, which represents one PS5. And, say you want to buy the PS5, right? Well, now if you split the supply chain production of, say, the PS5s and just say, hey, we're able to suddenly produce with a lead time of a week or something, whatever the lead time is, that commodity, that PS5, and I split that commodification, that manufacturing of it with the NFT and say, we're going to produce in units, 1,000 PS5s. We're going to mint 1,000 NFTs. So instead of going to the store and sending the PS5s to the store and trying to guess where those PS5s should go for where the most people are buying things and where most people are trying to actually consume those goods, because I doubt something like Marfa, Texas is going to want more PS5s than say Los Angeles. So how do you determine who's getting the PS5 in Marfa, Texas versus LA? These are the classic economic coordination problems that we've been talking about for years. But so the PS5's now going on this route, you purchase an NFT, which gives you the right to get a PS5, right? So instead of purchasing the NFT and consuming the PS5 in the process, we're able to split that and say, hey, I have an NFT for this PS5. I know it's not going to be widely available in this other place, so I'm going to sell my NFT of this rather than take the consumption of it immediately. So if the manufacturer is able to start producing these in tandem with this and saying, hey, we just need to make sure that every NFT redeemed gives us an actual good for it. So it allows us to split the speculation for it. And it allows us to remove ourselves from that supply chain, the consumers part, more or less, remove the consumer side of things from the supply chain, where now the manufacturer just has to worry about, hey, I just need to make sure that this person gets their PS5 in time or within a reasonable amount of time. But it allows us to move that speculation, the market action on it, all into a separate place where suddenly everyone can participate in that economy and see and say, hey, maybe that PS5 wasn't actually worth 3 times more at the time. It was maybe only worth like 1.2 times more or 1.3 times more. And that way it eliminates this huge sort of economic calculation that consumers don't even realize that they're participating in.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that line of argument concerning this potential here. That's very interesting. On the flip side, I want to ask you, what is crypto bad at? What are the downsides of crypto? Why don't we just all use crypto tomorrow? Or what other reason might existing currencies continue to exist?
One, because the wide-scale markets don't use crypto. 2, user experience for crypto is not as good as money, as like state-regulated money. It's difficult. You have to hold on to that currency. I think Entropy, what I'm trying to do at Entropy is going to make that better and easier. And I think over time, hopefully our product develops in a place where it just becomes just much easier for the common person to just not worry about losing that money. On top of this, there's a whole lot of regulation and things that are involved where, if somebody's not equipped to handle the volatility of that cryptocurrency, it can really hurt them and harm them, if they're just trying to hold on to it. That's, where we get things like stable coins, for example. And so to me, it's also just incredibly slow compared to, say, just transacting with money. I think over time, we're going to see more efficient things happen. But to me, the blockchain is kind of like this component of just measuring market forces and doing this kind of participation. And I don't think most people actually really need to do that. A consumer doesn't exactly need to worry about the market forces of, purchasing something. And they probably don't want to. They just want to consume something. And so I think ultimately there's going to be like ways for people to participate like on the fringe of this. I'm not ready to answer exactly what that's going to look like. In the same way, I think like the end goal of all this, like I think I forget who exactly pointed this out, but like we don't exactly know what the end goal of a lot of anarchism is. We just know that we have like anti-authoritarianism, we dislike hierarchy, and that kind of thing. And, we're willing to see what that's going to be. And we can kind of the whole point is building solutions that can handle it. I think that eventually somebody, like if we're talking about other bad things that I think crypto leads to is like, obviously like there's some not great stuff that can be transacted on any gray market, with any currency. That's not a great thing. Nobody wants to see, fascists or, predators using cryptocurrency, using the market that, they want to see it, they want to use. But likewise, I always compare it to, say, like cryptography. Like nobody wants to see fascists use end-to-end encryption, because why? Like it makes it easier for the anti-fascists to do their jobs, and likewise, that's kind of like the downside of it to me is just, the commodification of a lot of things, which a lot of people don't like. But I think in reality, like in today's, post-capitalist world and things like this, I think there's a degree of commodification that happens with everything we do, our privacy, our rights, all this kind of stuff. But I think there's a philosophical question asked for it, like, were these things always commodified? Have we always been participating in this equation, whether we liked it or not? And I think I don't think a lot of people are actually exactly willing to look at that and say, like, how much am I willing to commodify what I do on a day-to-day basis? And is it wrong to commodify it? There's some things that I think are probably wrong to commodify. Like I would never want to commodify my privacy rights, except until when I do, when I want to trade privacy for, using Twitter. I use Twitter. I use a phone. I've exchanged my privacy rights for that. What was the market calculation that went into me exchanging my privacy rights? How much are my privacy rights worth to Apple, to Twitter? It's like, well, I don't know. Are people really willing to actually look at that and someday observe that and go, it's exactly worth this much? And, I don't think people are really exactly excited about that. And I think that does scare a lot of people.
You mentioned your company, Entropy. So curious, what what led you to start that project, and what do you mean when you call it a decentralized custodian for crypto? Like you said, it's offering this better user experience, I guess, but maybe I could hear about that.
Entropy, what it means for us when we say decentralized custodian, the full tagline we use is decentralized asset custodian. And there's actually companies that exist that hold on to crypto for you and just give you the right to send it, move it around. We usually call this signing authority. So if you hold Bitcoin or Ethereum or something, you hold on to a private key that allows you to transact on the blockchain and move funds from A to B or whatever, or sign a transaction, use a smart contract, whatever. There's companies like Coinbase, there's companies like Kraken, Anchorage, all these big centralized companies that, use existing state regulation and all these things to essentially sit on top of your crypto for you to make sure you can securely send it and use it. This exact type of service is not accessible to people like you and me. It's accessible to large companies. It's accessible to exceptionally wealthy people. Like we're talking about when you use them, they're taking basis points of every transaction you do on those networks. And then they say, hey, we skim some money off the top as is our right for holding on to it. And likewise, there's an annual fee you have to pay on top of it to keep it going. And this is huge numbers, right? We're talking for some people, they're spending millions on custody. And other folks are just spending tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, And so it's not accessible to the common average user. And that's what Entropy is doing. We took cryptography, something called threshold cryptography, where we basically take your private key. We're able to securely take the private key and split it into N pieces and distribute those pieces to our decentralized network of computers. And then you hold on to a few of those pieces. And so when you want to sign a transaction to send money from A to B, you use the network to construct a signature together. That way the private key is never held by any single person. Likewise, otherwise it'd be held by the whole private key would be held by Coinbase or Anchorage or something like that. Instead, nobody holds on to the full key. And then the signing authority is distributed across a bunch of computers. So when you want to sign something, you just have to set certain conditions and parameters for how that signature might happen. So for example, somebody could say, hey, I only want to spend $100 or $500 worth of crypto every month or something like that. They can set that condition, and when they send the transaction to the network, we check that. We say, hey, let's make sure nobody sent that much money to a person before, so that way we sign it. Or you can put address allow listing, which basically says I can only send money to these people. Or you could do time limits, which is a pretty common one. It takes me 72 hours to do a transaction. That's something you can do. And that's kind of what we're trying to get into the hands of common people. And, the other thing that's kind of interesting about this is since I said, most users have never been able to access this. And then, so what that means for those large centralized companies that are building or trying to build this technology, they're exactly rent seekers. They only exist, they only make money because they're in a position of power that enables them to say, we're not going to do this transaction unless you pay us this fee. And who knows, if you don't pay the fee, they probably won't give you back your private key if you ever need it, right? So what we're doing is we're trying to get rid of that business model. We're attacking that business model at its core and being we're not going to rent seek on top of your crypto. Instead, we're trying to find a business model that is a positive feedback loop for everyone in the system. So everybody in the system can benefit from what we're doing. And that enables us to not just take a position of authority and signing authority over the person. It allows us to participate with the person, with the user itself, and say, hey, if you use our system, you get such and such benefit, and you don't have to pay for this giant rent-seeking thing on top of it. We're going to reward you in some way and try to actually, do that. The exact specifics of our business model, the way we're doing that, is not something we've created yet. We're this is something I even said in a lot of our pitches, is we don't have a business model that competes with it. But what we're doing, and this is kind of the interesting part of crypto, is that, if you're a user of this thing, we expect to be able to work with you, and you can help us understand how you want to pay for our service, how we can make money from this together. and how you can participate and also maybe share in some of that profit or whatever with us as well. And so that way, the company Entropy, what we're building, essentially just acts as just a market actor in that point. We're just a group of people who are maintaining software at this point. We're not trying to sit here and uphold our organization from this purely by the existence of the product itself. We're trying to be like, hey, we're just like you, except we have developers on our team. And if you have developers and you build a large thing around yourself to like build on top of this protocol or project, it's just as good as we are, right? And you can participate and vote in it, change the fees, change whatever you want. And that's kind of what we're trying to do, is just build a voluntary means of just building this custodian that is very, very different from the current existing rent-seeking sort of parasitic business models that already exist.
Well, it's very intriguing hearing about the precise mechanisms you're kind of trying to develop on that issue of I mean, it's interesting hearing about kind of these other business models for doing cryptocurrency that that you think are kind of like weak or fallible, or at least less desirable than a potential alternative. So I do want to ask about the recent. It's been a couple months, but I hope they can like edit the bird out of this or something. I don't know. But talk about like all these kind of huge scams that have emerged in the crypto space that have really soured a lot of people on it. And so I want to hear, as someone with skin in the game, like you said, like what are your thoughts on that stuff and how that relates to crypto as a technology?
People ask me about scams all the time, and my biggest thing with it is like, we're not trying to build a system where scams aren't possible. Frankly, that's not what I'm trying to do. It's a voluntary system. If somebody's going to scam someone, they're probably going to try to do it. This exists the same as any market. I've been scammed before. It's like, it's not in crypto, but like in, just the real world, right? Like it's a thing that happens. Ponzi schemes exist outside of crypto. Bernie Madoff did his whole thing. As well, like who's to speak for the fraud that isn't accounted for in the global economy, right? Like that's huge. It's a huge number, and no one's willing to there's no way of determining it or finding it out. Crypto is smaller, so the scams that do stand out are more present. And they also affect the volatility a bit more. But really the way I look at it is like, crypto to me is all game theory on a system where we can actually measure it and participate in it and incentivize people for it, And so when I see scams, I see people who are doing like this sort of economic calculation, trying to be like, oh, I can make this I can make money from this in this some way and sort of disappear. But it also serves to hurt the currency itself. So like somebody made a bunch of ETH, sure, in this scam, but let's see, did it actually work out in a long period of time? Like I would actually be very interested in seeing this. If you measure like the cost basis of which scammers gained money in the last bull market, when the market crashed as a result of their actions, are they still profitable? Who knows? Was it worth all the effort and like all the illegal action and the risks that you took to actually get that money? Was it worth it? For some people it probably was. For others, probably not. I kind of see it as like organizations, scams seeking to serve themselves. They have to prop themselves up on something. And of course they're going to scam you to keep them alive, right? But this isn't to me any different than say like, pharmaceutical companies keeping patents and pushing the price up only for it to like drop when it becomes useless. If you compare like the existing like scams, quote unquote scams that exist in the modern economy, like I don't really see a difference in it. Like it's just more affecting just average. Like I guess really, I'm not even going to say that. Crypto like scams affect a certain class of people, but the traditional market economy scams that already exist, affect everyone, right? Like who knows to the degree that Amazon is committing fraud, where an average person is not benefiting from it, as well as stuff like look at pharmaceutical companies, what they're doing to limit access to drugs and medicine. It's not because of access to resources or supply chains. If they wanted to get certain drugs to say Africa or to other underserved nations, they could, but they just don't, because maybe not because it's not profitable, but certainly because, they're not going to make any more money doing something else somewhere else, to me, that's kind of the core of the scam for me. Like, I kind of see capitalism as just a giant scam already. Like, we're being stripped of our rights to participate in a market, in like a fair market. We're forced to work. We're forced to participate in the trades that we don't want to. I'm forced to give up I'm forced to participate in intellectual property scams. These are scams. I think intellectual property is just a giant scam. We're forced to participate in it. And, we're forced to pay our landlord, who has no utility on the property itself. They have like no reason to sit there. I certainly don't have to pay them. What are they going to do? Use the police to kick me out? Like, of course, it's a scam. That's all of it. All of that to me is a scam. And I think it's unfair to criticize crypto for the existence of, say, like large scammers like, Do Kwon and Terra, which recently brought down like the whole thing, FTX, which I don't consider a crypto company. They were an exchange, a centralized exchange. It's not fair to call them a crypto company or crypto by any means. And likewise, like everyone knew they were sketchy. So they scammed a whole lot of people, and then it really hurt the space. It was a very big shame that did happen. But is it any different from, say, like the Lehman Brothers collapsing because they were scamming people on mortgages, among other things? Is it different from Bear Stearns, collapsing because of what they were doing? I really don't see a difference between those things. And I think that because it's crypto, because it's so transparent and also early and volatile, we're more willing to critique it for the scams than we are the existing global capitalist economy and say that is not a scam. Like, those are definitely scams. You just don't see them. Like, really, if you dig into what you see there in the modern economy, you're going to see how you're getting scammed. And I just think it's really unfair to critique crypto as a whole because of the actions of a few folks. We look at, like I said, look at banks, look at state actors, look at, the war on drugs, all these things that have taken our rights away to essentially push profit, to push the fiat system, to push the capitalist economy. Those are scams, clearly.
Well, that's a good segue into my last question, which I kind of asked with kind of tongue-in-cheek question, but curious to what your answer is. What is it like being an anti-capitalist? Admittedly, I guess a free market anti-capitalist, but still an anti-capitalist raising funds from wealthy capitalists for what the thing that you're actually trying to create and add value to the world. But what is that like with the I'd love to like just watch like a Shark Tank episode of you like as an anti-capitalist like having to navigate that environment.
For me, it really solidifies exactly what I like about crypto, is that it separates participants in the economic system. Where you talk to any venture capitalist in crypto and you tell them exactly what I said in this podcast, that I'm starting a company, blah, blah, blah. I'm an anti-capitalist, blah, 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 blah. I said all this in our pitches, all of it. Talked about decentralized supply chains. They love it. But the only thing is that they know they are not trying to take ownership in some ways. And they do have ownership in a very small way, but it pushes them in this force where they're just market actors in this really new economy. And that's all they are. In crypto, they like VCs and like all these venture capitalists who are, making a ton of money on this stuff. They're going to make money on it. But at a certain point, because it's so early, their money is kind of more cheap than other people. They have so much more money. They're able to plug a ton of money in and do it. And as a result, their dollar is technically, kind of worth less than $1. So it entitles them to do something. So when they lose money on it, it's actually just a drop in the bucket. So I really see capitalists and capitalism as a whole, and this really puts it forward for me, is that it is a participant in a much larger economic calculation. So really when we look at it is, are they going to participate in it? Yeah, of course. The state is participating in crypto already. That doesn't mean that they actually own the system. It doesn't mean that capitalism is the crypto system either. They're just market participants. And that's kind of how I see it. We're not, it could be an antagonistic relationship, really. Like they're just seeking profit. That's it. Who knows how long these institutions are able to stay afloat, as long as the traditional markets stay up, they can probably stay alive. But I think we've seen how fragile that system really is already. So who knows how long those market players are going to stay afloat and actually continue participating in the system. When they lose their money, when they collapse, the money changes hands and it gets sifted from just one wealthy institution to a bunch of different wealthier institutions. And over time, I think it fosters down. It'll be more equal, which is kind of the whole point of markets, right? An efficient market, it creates more equality. And so right now, I think you're seeing this period of time where it's first person's early to it kind of get more wealthy. But over time, that wealth is going to quickly disappear because, as you know, those participants are not operating fairly. They're not operating equally. They're state regulated. They have access to more things than the average person does. So they're really just kind of waiting. They're basically just we're waiting for them to get their card pulled, essentially. So if you ask about what's it like to maneuver in this system, it's, to me, it's not really all that different from just say existing in an economy already. To some higher degree, it is certainly. You're serving to make other people wealthy, which is unfortunate. But that's, for me, it's I'm really trying to build something new here and participate in this other economy. And I think that we can really build something more fair. And I don't think they actually quite understand exactly. Like I said, they're not participating. They don't have a full knowledge of what they're participating in. That's kind of my understanding of it. When you talk to them, they're like, the anti-capitalism, that's really cute. But then you talk to other market anarchists who are, talking about this, other folks will be like, this is just expropriation, And that's kind of how I might see it myself. I kind of see it more as expropriation than I do any other thing. This is going to be better for people who use crypto. And it's, they're going to get more wealthy, but who knows how long that game's going to continue being played. I actually don't think we're that far off from a future where the current actors in the system are, just essentially one bad day away from collapse, essentially. That's kind of how I see it. They're significantly more fragile, is what I will say, than this other new system.
Well, thank you so much for the very intriguing, enlightening interview for me. Thanks so much, Tux, for talking. This has been a learning experience for me. I don't know if I grasped every little detail of what you work on, but it's very interesting. It's very cool. No, I really appreciate you sharing your kind of perspective here that you've developed and what you're working on. Very interesting. I think it'll be very interesting for our listeners. So yeah, thank you for coming on.
Of course, thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Well, thanks for listening. Stay tuned for Mutual Exchange Radio next month as well. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Ciao.